This is Join Us in France, episode 180. Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France, its many quirks, its history, its language, and of course, destinations in France you want to learn about because hopefully you'll be visiting soon. On today's episode, I'm going to tell you the story of the Gallery of Kings on Notre Dame Cathedral, and about some Bible stories you'll easily find when you visit Notre Dame, and give you some help recognizing the saints in French churches. Notre Dame Cathedral is over 850 years old. Oh, the things it must have seen. But while Notre Dame cannot tell us the things that happened within its walls, we can pay attention to what the art is telling us. So let's look around together and open your eyes wide. Occasionally, I see someone in the cathedral, even at Notre Dame, who doesn't seem engaged in the visit at all. Some of them, they come all the way from the other side of the world to see it, and yet they walk around looking blasé or something. Maybe they just don't understand what they're looking at. I know we're all very busy, and we don't have time to do lots of research before we go visit places, but curiosity is great when traveling. So here's an episode dedicated to the curious traveler. So let's start strong with the story of the decapitated kings. Actually, it's not called the decapitated kings. It's called the Gallery of Kings at Notre Dame Cathedral, but I prefer to call it the decapitated kings. High above the three entrance portals of Notre Dame, the sculptors of the cathedral placed 28 kings. They all stand in one row, all wearing crowns, all looking down on their people. This is called the Gallery of Kings. I'll put photos on journesinfrance.com/180 because it's best if you can look and see what I'm talking about. But for those of you who can't look at them right now, let me describe it a little bit so you can picture it. Think of the main facade of Notre Dame. There are three portals or doors. Above the doors is a long horizontal line of statues that takes up the whole width of the cathedral. That's the Gallery of Kings. Above that is a balcony called the Virgin's Balcony. Above that is the western rose window in the center and something that looks like more portals to the sides. Above that, there's a row of columns and then the Gallery of Chimeras all across the whole width. And finally, the North Tower on the left and the South Tower on the right. The Gallery of Kings is probably 30 feet off the ground and the statues are 15 feet tall. They are massive. When you go visit, I recommend you bring binoculars or a zoom lens because even though the statues are very large, it's hard to see them from the ground without some help. But if you go to joinusinfrance.com/180, you'll see it all very clearly because I have a great zoom lens and I love to take pictures of cathedrals to share with you. The thing is, those statues from the 13th century were not labeled or signed, and people did not know who the kings were. They assumed they were the kings of France. They all have crowns. They all look down on you. Yeah, why not? French kings. Revolutionaries were not fond of French kings, as you know. So in 1793, they climbed up there and vandalized the statues. Notre Dame was in a pretty sorry state by the end of the French Revolution, as we will see later, and breaking the statues didn't help any. Chopping heads off was a thing during the French Revolution. They started with chopping off the heads of the stone kings, and Louis XV was next 3 years later. He could have taken the hint and abdicated, but he didn't. Once the heads were down, the people of Paris had a little bit of fun hitting the heads of the kings, breaking things off. I mean, they're made of stone, so you can't much of a dent if you're kicking them with your shoes. So most of the damage happened when they fell down. At some point in 1793 or 1794, a man called Lacanal, owner of a hotel near today's Opéra Garnier, but of course the Opéra Garnier wasn't there yet, decided that he wanted to take the heads and put them in a big basement room between his hotel and a bank adjacent to his hotel. How he pulled that off, I don't know. The distance between Notre Dame and the hotel is about 3 kilometers. Some say Mr. Lacanal took the heads to protect them from the indignities inflicted by the Vandals. Others say he wanted to use the stones for something. I don't know his motives, but he put them there deep under his hotel and walled them in. And they were forgotten about. Why did he wall them in? Maybe he was worried that he'd get in trouble for stealing them. I don't know. Then move forward 200 years to 1977. The hotel is still there and it needs to do some renovations that involve breaking down the wall. And surprise! The workers find 21 big giant stone heads behind the wall. Current owners had no clue that more than 400 artifacts from Notre Dame Cathedral had been lying under their feet since the French Revolution. Because Lacanal didn't just take the heads, he took everything he could. Historians and archaeologists came to investigate, and eventually the heads were removed and placed inside the Cluny Museum. Experts learned a lot from those heads. One thing in particular was that this proved that the original statues that adorned Notre Dame in the 1300s were painted. Much of the exterior of Notre Dame was painted in bright colors back then. It's hard to fathom today because we always see cathedrals in their natural stone color or with layers of gray pollution, depending on when the last renovation took place. But most of them were painted. And not painted white or cream or something. No. They used bright reds and greens and blacks. They were not afraid of color at all. If you go see the big giant heads in the Cluny Museum, which I recommend you do, you can still see bits of paint on them. They made some amazing paint in the 1300s because there was still some left 500 years later when the statues stood in the elements the whole time. I can't keep paint on my wooden exterior shutters for more than 4 or 5 years. I want some paint from the 1300s. So, just for the record, I've heard many times that the original chopped heads were thrown into the Seine River. And I've probably repeated that myself, but no, that is not what happened. 21 of the heads were under the Hotel Moreau at 21 Rue de la Chaussée-d'Antin, near the Opéra Garnier. And we're still missing 7 heads, so keep looking, folks. They're somewhere in Paris or in France. Oh, well, who knows? I don't know where they are, but they're somewhere. So when you go to Notre Dame today, the Gallery of Kings you are looking at dates from a fairly recent renovation effort led by Viollet-le-Duc. Well, a recent renovation effort in French term. Notre Dame Cathedral underwent major renovations between 1844 and 1864. So yeah, it's recent from 154 years ago. Modern sculptors had fun with the faces on the new Gallery of Kings. They kept the overall look the same, with the kings all lined up. But they modeled some of the faces after famous people of the time, one of them being the aforementioned architect Viollet-le-Duc. So there you have it. That's the story of the decapitated French kings on the facade of Notre Dame. And when you go, you'll be able to tell your kids about angry revolutionaries who climbed up there and chopped the heads off the statues. Tell them to imagine the cathedral painted in bright colors. And if they don't believe you that Notre Dame Cathedral used to be painted, walk them to the left side of the church and look closely at some of the statues that are located close to the ground. You can see tiny remnants of paint on some of them. Now let's talk about Bible stories on Notre Dame. There are lots of Bible stories on all cathedrals, and Notre Dame is no exception. But the one I want to attract your attention to is right in front, above the central door, underneath the Gallery of Kings. And I'll have pictures of that on the website as well. It's fairly easy to see from the ground. It's centrally located, indicated that the designers of the cathedral didn't want it to go unnoticed. That was the central story of medieval Catholic teachings, and they wanted people to see it right as they approached the church. The sculpture shows an angel holding a scale in his hand, with a supplicant on one side of the scale and a devilish creature pulling on the other side to steal that soul. And right underneath, you see a bunch of souls looking quite tormented. I think they are the souls of the damned. But I'm not sure who the angel is, because I assumed it must be St. Peter, since that's the one who's supposed to decide who gets into heaven or not. But in some reference materials that I read to prepare for this episode, I saw it referenced to as St. Michael. But St. Michael is the one who slew the dragon, and this one is not holding a sword, so I'm not sure. What do you think? So that leads me into, how do you recognize saints in a church? Identifying who a statue is not an easy job. Scholars often disagree, but there are some known markers of various people, especially when it comes to the original 12 apostles. Now, the Catholic Church also has a ton of saints, and so I don't know that anybody knows them all off the top of their head. It's really difficult to know, and there's some big scholars that have written books years ago that have now been proved wrong on their identification of statues. So don't feel bad if you can't tell who the statue is representing, because it's really hard to do. But let's go through the 12 apostles and what their typical markers or signs are. Andrew, he's the brother of Peter. He carries a cross that looks like an X. He often has nails, a fisherman's nest, or fish. Bartholomew carries a knife and a slice of detached human skin. I'm not making this up. There's a good story in there somewhere, but I don't have time to linger on that today. But someday, you know me, I'm going to look into that slice of detached human skin. James the Greater, brother of John the Apostle, is adorned with a shell, a pilgrim staff, a long coat, and a water bottle, because he walked a lot. He is, of course, the one associated with the Compostela pilgrimage. James the Lesser carries a hammer. The Apostle John is associated with the eagle, the chalice and serpent, and a book. Apostle Jude also carries a hammer and sometimes a bow. Matthew carries an axe or a purse, and he is surrounded by angels. He has the sword of martyrdom and sometimes a book. Paul, who was not an apostle but preached all over the Mediterranean, carries a sword. Philip is pictured with a long staff that ends with a cross, or sometimes a dragon. Peter is pictured with a boat with chains, keys, a fisherman's nest, and walking on the water. He is the one that most people can recognize because he often has the keys. Simon is with a boat, a book, or a saw. And finally, Thomas has a javelin or tools. When you go inside of Notre Dame, you will also see painted wooden panels that tell several Bible stories, and all of those are labeled. So in that case, we know exactly what we're looking at. The picture I'll share with you on the website, so joinusinfrance.com/180, shows Jesus and the miraculous fish from John 21st. I've read these Bible stories, some of them long ago, but and I enjoy recognizing them when I visit a church. So I hope you'll get a kick out of looking out for these. Next week on the podcast, I'll be telling you another wonderful story that takes place at Notre Dame Cathedral, the story told by Victor Hugo that you know as the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I listened to the book this week and I loved it, and I can't wait to tell you about it. I haven't seen the Disney movie yet, but I'll do my best to watch it this week in preparation for the podcast. See, it's a rough life. I have to watch movies and read books. And yes, The Gallery of Kings plays into Victor Hugo's story as well. Thank you, Tom Bubnick, for pledging to support the show on Patreon this week, and Mike Freem also. Both of them are new supporters of the show on Patreon, and they join a growing list of people who enjoy the show and want it to continue. So thank you very much to both of you and to all the patrons. And to check out how you can help out the show financially, go to joinusinfrance.com/support. All right, I promised shorter shows, and that's what I did this week. So thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful time planning your next trip to France. Au revoir. I will talk to you next week. The Join Us in France Travel Podcast is written and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2017 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.